An hour. Is she? I'm gonna take the copy. I'm so. Yeah. Awesome. Good evening, from the Washington poets of the first Arabic speaking community in the United States that that centered itself on Washington Street and on the Lower West Side of Manhattan. An unknown part of Arab American and New York history until all of these projects bubbled up, one of which is the most important one is the installation in the park. So this is the second session of today's symposium. The first was on abstraction in contemporary Middle Eastern art, and Sara Bouhadou, who's the artist who's getting ready to leave her work as interpreting Islam, Arabic calligraphy in an abstract mode. So, and this session is on the literary milieu that gave rise to these Arabic and English publishers and editors and writers who worked in the Syrian colony and whose work we celebrate in the art that in Elizabeth H. Berger Plaza. So I'm handing it over to Abigail to start us off. We're going to try and finish on time, which is meant to be 4 o'clock, but we may do it because, well, Abigail will tell you one of our speakers has had to leave, so has had to be absent. So we may make it by 4. We'll see. Thank you, Abigail.
Yeah. My name is Abigail Valdelay. I'm Associate Professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies here at NYU. And because I am a historian, I'm going to start with just a little very brief overview for those of you who may have gotten this far in this wonderful celebratory weekend without knowing much about Little Syria. So I'm going to give a little introduction to the history of Little Syria, and then I will pass the floor to my distinguished guests. We have 2 here physically present, and we have 1 who will be joining online. Unfortunately, our 4th presenter, Elizabeth Saylor, is unable to be here today. So I'll start with this discussion of the history and literary influence of Little Syria. Between 1880 and 1924, nearly 95,000 Arabs came from Ottoman Greater Syria, which encompasses Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan, to the United States as part of the Great Migration. Many of them settled in New York, which became a major hub of the Syrian community in the US. And the center of this colony was in the Lower West Side of Manhattan, just south of what would later become the World Trade Center, and which was known at the time as Little Syria. As Linda Jacobs, in her 3 books, which if you haven't read, you need to read, has shown us so vividly, the neighborhood was characterized by Syrian grocery stores, cafes serving Middle Eastern food and Turkish coffee, men wearing fezzes, silk merchants, and dry goods purveyors. Arabic was the lingua franca, and immigrants who arrived in New York were able to build connections with others from their region, even as they constructed new American identities. One of the most important parts of products of this vibrant community was literary. Writers, teachers, and intellectuals came together to form new literary societies, to write and publish newspapers, and to compose poetry and novels. The collective output of these immigrants to the Americas is termed mahjar literature, diaspora literature, and Little Syria was its undisputed center. This was facilitated by the adaptation of linotype machines to print Arabic text, an innovation by the founder of Al-Huda newspaper, which became the first linotype printed commercial newspaper in Arabic in 1912. We heard a little bit about this from Sarah right at the end of her talk. It's a revolution. It happened in New York before it happened in the Middle East, and it was a really global revolution that came out of this introduction of Arabic linotype. Other outlets like the newspaper Kawkab America or Kawkab America, founded in 1892, the magazine Al Funun, The Arts, published by Nasif Arida, and more than 50 other Arabic language periodicals, served as outlets for the residents of Little Syria to discuss Arab and Ottoman politics and to experiment with new literary forms. The center of much of this literary activity was the Pen League or Pen Bond, Rebellion and Al-Qalam in Arabic, from which we get Al-Qalam, the pen, an organization initially founded by Nasib Arida and Abdelmasih Haddad in 1916, and later led by luminaries such as Khalil Gibran. It would eventually cease operating as a formal literary society after Gibran's death in 1931 and Mikhail Naimi's return to Lebanon in 1932. This literary society is what inspired the public art installation in Al-Qalam, Poets in the Park, that we are all here to celebrate today. And 6 of the 9 poets commemorated by name in the artwork were members of the Pen League. Rabita's members include Elia Abdelmadi, Nasib Arida, Khalil Gibran, Nadra Haddad, Mikhail Naimi, Amin Rihani, and 3 respected members of the literary community who were not members of the Pen League, Abbas Abu Shakra, and 2 female poets, Afifa Karam and Aghabia Ma'alouf. These authors and poets together sought to transform Arabic literature from its classical roots to new modern possibilities. And the works they produced would revolutionize both Arabic and American literature. So the session that we are embarking on will focus on the milieu of Little Syria and on the literary creations of these early writers. We'll start with Dr. Hani Bawardi, who is Associate Professor of History and Arab American Studies at University of Michigan, Dearborn. He is a specialist in the history of Arab American communities. His 2014 book, The Making of Arab Americans from Syrian Nationalism to U.S. Citizenship, was published by University of Texas Press and focuses on this early Syrian American community and its political advocacy, both within the United States and in the Middle East. And I've just learned that he has an enormous personal archive that covers many of these early Syrian American figures and the political organizations that they created here. So I will pass the floor to Hani. Each person will talk for about 20 minutes, and we'll hopefully have time for questions at the end. Hani.
Thank you, Abby. And thank you, Edmund, for being here, my co-panelist online. Thank you all for taking the time. Good afternoon.
Honey, I need to interrupt. Can everyone hear him in the back? Okay, just wanted to make sure, sorry.
Then I'll remain soft-spoken.
I can't hear you, sorry.
I'm just gonna grab the mouse so I can have your other speaker
Oh, yeah.
on Zoom.
Okay.
Okay, I'll do that.
Okay, a couple of names that maybe should be mentioned as part of the Pen Bond, Rebellion and Visual Abstraction, William Cassiflis, and Rashid Ayoub, which we I guess we're on our room in this day or something. So the book Hikayat al-Mahjar, the subject of my talk today, or Tales of Emigration, or Tales of the Diaspora, which will probably stick, is a collection of short stories published in 1921 by the Syrian emigre writer Abdelmasih Haddad, born, depending on who you talk to, 1890, I think 1888 is more accurate, died in New York in 1963, was born in Homs, Syria. This work consisted on a unique Arab emigre literature because it was among the first narrative works to focus entirely on depicting the lives of Syrian immigrants in America, documenting their struggles, their adaptation to the new society. Haddad was founding member of the Pen Bond or Pen League, Rebellion and Visual, alongside Khalil Gibran, Khalil Naimi, originally Amin Rihani in 1916 also, until the unlike the romantic nostalgia for the homeland that his famous colleagues were known for, Haddad's writings provide a direct and realistic portrayal of the daily lives of immigrants. As he stated in the book's introduction, his goal was to offer a mirror in which members of his community could see their own behaviors and correct their faults. He was a reformer, both overseas and within his adopted community. I offer my translation of the book's introduction, moved by the same curiosity that stirred Abdelmasih Haddad himself. Even though 105 years has passed since its publication, the veil remains tantalizingly intact. What lay concealed behind the crowded facade of clamorous shops, porch-side hookahs, and the ever-unfolding tales of fortune, ruin, and unending human drama? In short, it is time to begin to piece together our collective story from these and other sketches. Abdul Masih Haddad introduces his book with these words. Since I arrived in America, I have often observed various shapes and images of our Syrian American life. Hayatuna Suriya al-Amerikiya is the second oldest reference to Syrian American identity I could find. And I have wondered when our pen would move to document these panoramas to compel folks to draw on their lessons and secrets. The scenes I mean are visual representations of secrets and manifestations of what lies behind, hidden within souls. I used to see them, read them, hear them, and feel them. And I found a vast field that I wish some writer would enter to depict Syrian life through the style of short stories. This thought kept recurring to me until I wrote my first story, Abdul Fitra, or Slave of Habit, servant of nature, if you will, for a notion that crossed my mind to fill some space in the pages of Al-Sa'ih, his magazine, The Traveler. Before I knew it, I found myself driven into that very field I had wished other writers would enter. No sooner had that story appeared than I found myself surrounded by friends asking me how I had come to write a story that was an exact replica of a scene from our lives in the diaspora. Then I felt a gentle hand holding mine. It was the hand of the head of the Pen Bond Literary Society, Khalil Gibran, and I heard him say to me, quote, "I want to read a story of this kind in every issue of your newspaper, and you have no excuse not to do this work. Before you lies a wide field you have entered, so delve into its corners, plunge into its depths, and bring us what you find there. فأمامك ميدان واسع ولجته فتعمق في حناياه وغص إلى قاعه وجئنا بما تغوص إليه." Of course, he told him that in Kevorkian Lebanese. روح خش بين هالناس وهات ورجينا شو عم تلاقي. How many of you speak Arabic, by the way? Oh, cool. Okay. Then, after a while, he came to me, trying to convince me to collect these stories into a separate book. I saw no way around it because what I heard from this dear friend and from other friends who are knowledgeable about literary etiquette and eager to shed the outdated garment and cloaks we have worn and replace them with attire befitting this era. There's a lot to unpack here. The man is a reformer in every respect, politically, socially, but also in literary sense, as you all know. That opened my ears and eyes. My natural inclination led me to do what I had wished others would do. So I gave free rein to my imagination in studying our Syrian life in the diaspora, observing its scenes and depicting them in the form of short tales. Thus, I gathered this book, which may be a prelude to others, God willing, or rather a prelude to others because I found myself enamored with this study and realized that I am going along with the small stream, seeking the waters of the deep sea. If with these stories I have not reached the goal nor depicted what I must do, what must be depicted of the deep Syrian psyche, the stream I am in will cast me into the depths where I can deeply study Syrian life from many aspects, from the beginning of emigration to where we arrived now, meaning 1921. And he goes on to explain that for this reason, above, in pursuit of this sought-after thing, the mirror of the self, I undertook to write these stories and call them Tales of the Diaspora, because they pertain to the diaspora. Perhaps I may benefit others through them. If not, then intention suffices for me, and peace be upon them. You have to hear this in Arabic, just a couple of lines. لهذا فجرت وراء هذه المنشودة مرآة النفس. أقدمت على كتابة هذه الأقاصيص ودعوتها حكايات المهجر لأنها تختص بالمهجر. عساني أفيد بها وإلا فحسبي النية وعليكم السلام. So here's a sample of some of the stories in no special order. One I chose is Statue of Liberty, تمثال الحرية. It's about Nakhle Masou, married a young woman, 10 years his junior, Adama, in Syria. And then he was the emir of his own home. His wife feared and respected him, and try as best as you can not to listen to the words through the prism of the present. Again, there's a lot to unpack here, and Western feminism does not serve to explain all of this. If you're inclined, we'll talk about it. Seeking his favor, his wife that is, while he ruled as the unquestioned head of the household. But almost immediately after the wedding, the necessity of immigrating to America, that Mecca of mercenaries, took root in his mind. Despite his parents weeping pleas, Nakhle set off to the New World with his bride. He could not bear to leave her behind, so they traveled together from Beirut to Marietta and to New York, and finally landed in a large village in Ohio. The family struggled from the start. Debts piled up against Nakhle from relatives and friends, and though he worked tirelessly, selling goods, laboring in factories for wages, he could barely keep his head above water. For these 3 years, he remained trapped, eating, drinking with his wife, but suffocating under the tightening noose of debt. His creditors, though kin, offered no mercy, and he put them off with promises until his wits failed him. Then a successful relative, a warehouse owner who supplied peddlers with popular goods, offered the solution. He told him, "You stay in the factory and let your wife go out and sell things. I will give her a large peddler pack," they called it a purse for the ladies, and a kishe for the men, which is a huge trunk they carried on their shoulders.
Yeah.
And he said, "I will supply her for everything she needs and teach her English and how to sell things. Not a year will pass before you have risen above your debt." Nakhle refused adamantly. You can imagine what he might have said in Arabic. "أعوذ بالله مو معقول مرتي تشتغل وأنا أقعد بالبيت." This is my Lebanese. I'm a Palestinian, by the way. اللبنانية لهجة محببة. Tears nearly falling from his eyes at the thought of putting his wife to work, but the relative convinced him in America women were more successful at work than men. We know very little about women peddlers. They were successful, by the way. So Nakhle relented. Within 6 months, Lady Adama had become a skilled saleswoman, mastering both the trade and the English language. After 6 years, the family moved to New York City. They now had 3 children, and Adama continued to pursue every opportunity for income while Nakhle stayed home, caring for the children. He had given up working entirely. The whole family's existence now hung from his wife's purse. And so Nakhle was no longer the emir in his house. He had become a hired servant to his wife and children. She had become the head of the family, gradually transitioning from partner to commander. Her husband became nothing more than at your service. That continued. One day, I'm going to paraphrase parts of this in the interest of time. She came home, he was not home. The kids were wreaking havoc. The house was a mess. She tidied up, fed the kids, went looking for him. He was sitting in Battery Park, staring in the distance. Can you see the Statue of Liberty from Battery Park, by the way?
Yes.
Certain parts, yeah.
Yeah, so that's where he must have been sitting. Because she dragged him home, scorned him. She descended upon him with insults and reproaches, drove him home, and warned him that if he ever made a search for him again, that she would put him out. And throw me out, he said. His patience finally running out. Am I not the man of the house, the father of the children, and your husband? And her reply was, you are all those things in your country, but here in America, I am everything. The Statue of Liberty raises its hands and it shows, and it is a woman's statue. So I have the right to raise my hand in my own home and command and forbid. Does that please you? أهلا وسهلا إذا لا الباب بوس على الجمل. الله معك. So at that moment, Nakhle lamented the statue, remembered the Statue of Liberty. So he must have seen it from where he was sitting in Battery Park. And finally understood the meaning of its raised hand clutching its light. He answered his wife in a faint voice, if that statue raises one hand, I raise both hands from every affair. But when we return to our country, I shall become, God willing, a man again with man's rights. In Arabic, it reads differently, but the message is beyond your women's rights. I mean, it is essentially careful what you wish for. You want to immigrate, that comes with a package, basically. So the second story is Abdul Fitra, which is one of the first one he wrote and published, which gave him this idea to delve into. I don't want to translate this verbatim or closely. I'd like to offer some kind of interpretation and what it means in the lives of immigrants. Hanna Marcos. Hanna Moros emigrated to America as a teenager, learning broken English through peddling. From a shy beginner, he grew into a wealthy, confident man with two faces. He did well financially. American on one side, villager at heart. He shaved daily but cursed the land that forced him to, preferring his native kumbaz over trousers, sirwal, and sleeping under Syrian trees in his dreams. After years, he obtained a passport and returned to Syria, expecting progress. Instead, he found no modern tailors, no bathrooms, not modern bathrooms at least, no benches in parks, and poor economy trading piastres instead of rials. That's what they called dollars at the time. Disillusioned, he returned to America, then immediately longed for Syria's freedom from constraints. Torn between American comfort and Syrian liberty, he read Mikhail Naimi's poem and resolved, quote, I wish that I did not wish. He concluded that each market has its own custom, abandoning the hope of ever fully belonging anywhere. The story of Hanna Moros illustrates a central paradox of immigrant experience. I believe we all experience. Acculturation often produces not belonging, but perpetual estrangement. Hanna develops what we might call a bicognitive self, American on the outside, Syrian at heart. His dual identity, rather than enriching him, fractures his sense of wholeness. Linguistic marginalization marks the first struggle. Hanna's broken English mixed with Arabic words, his tongue cannot properly pronounce, signal to native speakers that he remains perpetually foreign. He can never fully express his authentic self in the adopted tongue. Something I struggle with sometimes, after a drink or two especially. Performative assimilation followed. He shaves daily, wears Western clothes, trousers, and dines with forks, not from preference, but from coercive conformity. Internally, he curses these rituals as imprisoning. And he gives a couple of funny examples of how in restaurants and public places, he eats with fork and knife, and he struggles with that and he hates it. Then he goes home and digs in with his hands It's the only way to eat chicken anyway. Ultimately, Han recognizes that perpetual wishing self for what is lost or untenable becomes the heaviest chain. His resolution that I wish that I did not wish suggests that immigrant identity may find peace not in resolving contradictions, but in ceasing to demand resolution. For college students studying diaspora, Hanna's story teaches that acculturation is really a linear process toward integration, but often a lifelong negotiation between two irreconcilable homes. The next story is Al-Hakim bi Amro. And if you study history, I mean, this is like Persian influence, where we have Al-Muntasir, Al-Mustasim is the name of the ruler. It becomes Al-Hakim will be Amrillah, it's embellishment. So there's hints that this guy is really full of himself, which he is. And there's a lot of self to fill, as you will see. He recalls, he really wanted to breach that facade we talked about and go inside the homes of people in Washington's street to see what goes on in those homes. So he uses a friend as an excuse who needed to go visit his uncle, and he leans on Abdul Masih Haddad, so his uncle won't trap him and make him stay for dinner and all of that. So, come with me, we'll leave early. Just make an excuse to leave and we'll leave. Which Haddad, by the way, was in no hurry to leave because he wanted to document and observe. So he felt that persistent curiosity, a desire to peer behind these crowded facades and discover within them the substance of a deeper story, a meaningful, a mingling of history and social truth. So one evening he went with his friend Najib to the house of his uncle Daidis. So they go inside. I'm going to paraphrase this also, just in case we have time to chat about these things. They found Uncle Davis as tall as he is wide. When he sat down, the chair disappeared behind him completely, talks nonstop while smoking his nargile constantly. أهلا وسهلا تفضلوا قعدوا. And all this welcoming, كل هذا كان منه وخشة النربيج لم تبرح معضوضة بين أسنانه كأنها خلقت كذلك وكأنه هو ولد وبفيه النرجيلة, as if he was born with a hookah in his mouth. So he drifted in thought, Abdul Masih, thinking, where did I see this guy before? And he drove his memory to remember, but he couldn't. A few minutes later, his wife came in, well-built, middle-aged woman, put her purse on the floor, welcomed the guests, and put the money she earned that day in her husband's pocket, and immediately went to the kitchen, and he began to mutter orders, bring this, bring that, حضري العشاء على طول, as you might expect. And later his daughter Maryam came in, same story. She put the purse down, slipped the money in his pocket, and went to the kitchen to help her mother. Very soon he was, saying, هاتوا البطاطا خذ صحن الشوربة ملي يا بنت كاسات المي صب يا مرة في صحن المستر يا ولد قدم الفجل لناحية عمك, يعني هاتوا المزة هاتوا تبولة هاتوا هذا وهاتوا هذاك. Yeah, familiar scene. The whole time clutching the nargile and smoking. Every few words he would draw a big breath and then breathe the smoke out. ويردفها بسحبة طويلة من النرجيلة فيخرج الدخان قسمين, واحد من باب المندب والآخر من جبل Vesuvius. Smoke would come in two streams, one from the Strait of Eden, and the other one is from Mount Vesuvius, his nose. So they leave, and then he asked his friend, I thought I saw your uncle before, but I couldn't remember. And the friend told him, oh yeah, his wife was sick for a time, and the man was irreconcilable. He was in bad shape. And then Abdul Masih Haddad remembered that he saw him in a hospital, begging the priest to give him a paper that his financial situation is dire, and to give him a letter to give to the hospital to be absolved from paying his wife's medical bills. And Abdul Masih Haddad basically made this point that, behind that facade, you have a lot of families that depend on peddling, but also, you can call it a patriarchal home, but that was expected during the period. But that peddling became like a small enterprise in a family orbit and beyond that. And fortunes were built that way. In the couple of minutes I have left, I want you to keep in mind that aside from those short stories that have a lot to unpack, Frank, a lot of lessons about early days of immigration, acculturation, indeed, it's never a linear process, and the language is a hurdle. But our poets documented all of that as an immigration historian. So we have like immigration paradigms from Anglo-conformity to, cultural pluralism and then multiculturalism. And we credit people like Horace Callan and others by coming up with this. It took until post-World War II for Americans in the South Pacific to acknowledge racism and that you can hold on to your culture and still be a full member of society, a citizen. That's cultural pluralism. Rehani wrote about that in Letters to Uncle Sam. A purely cultural pluralist discourse in 1919, way before Horace Callan. And when you read Abdul Masih Haddad, it's no different. And another person who wrote extensively an entire book called Adat Wataniya, it's called Habib Ibrahim Katiba. So they were extremely sophisticated, highly educated. They understood that, problematic process of belonging in the United States and navigated both belonging, resistance, acceptance, and cultural accommodation. And if you read Al-Khama'il, for example, which is a collection of poetry by Ali Abu Madi, you come across Rita or Gibran, that means eulogy. But you come across a poem called Mujahid. You know what jihad is, right? Mujahid is someone who struggles. And it's about, it was given at the invitation of the Muslim Youth Organization at the Academy of Music. It was a rita or eulogy for Musa Kazim Pasha al-Husseini. These are the things that our poets cared about. Another poem is called Abu Ghazi. Ghazi was a king of Iraq, a young person who was killed in a bloodlust. His father, Abu Ghazi, is none other than King Faisal. Those guys wanted King Faisal to be the king of all of geographic natural Syria. So if there was one thing that was foremost on their minds, I would say it was the fate of Syria. And this is something we're not making enough room for in the discourse. Philistine is another poem. Diyar al-Salami wa Ardul Hana. Yashukku ala al-kulli an tahzana. I read the first line to my friend Raja. He finished the rest and we left Jordan, 40 years ago. He read that. And there's also more poetry that celebrates Lebanon, but also celebrates Florida and Richfield. So they belong, but they never abandoned who they are, what Syria stood for in their lives. I'll end here.
Thank you. I don't know when the Abdul Masih Haddad thing was published. I didn't hear.
1921.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
We'll hold the rest of the questions until after all of our
sorry.
panelists have spoken. No, that's great. We'll move directly now to Edmund Gharib's talk. He is an analyst and commentator on Middle East history and politics. He was the first Mustafa Barzani Distinguished Scholar of Global Kurdish Studies at American University and taught at Georgetown and the University of Virginia. He has published 12 books on the Middle East. Most recently, in 2025, Seven Stories Press has reissued Enemy of the Sun, Poetry of Palestinian Resistance, which Gharib co-edited and which includes poetry he translated, and which was originally published by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1970. So please join me in welcoming Edmund, and we look forward to hearing your talk.
Well, thank you, Abigail, and Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. By the way, I have a copy of that book, signed by Abdul Masih Haddad to my father.
Of course you do.
I have also, actually, this is my interest in this whole thing, my academic side and journalistic side focused more on politics and history rather than on the Arab Americans and their work. But over the years, actually, since I was almost a teenager, I became interested in this field. And although just listening to the story, reading the stories, one of the stories actually I thought you might be mentioning was the one about the guy who is a fortune teller. And he has an American translating and people coming and asking him questions. And the guy doesn't know a word of English and the other doesn't know any Arabic. So it's a fascinating story. And really, this is amazing. I hope maybe you would go further and do some translations of it to English. Also, I want to take the opportunity to thank Dr. Linda Jacobs for what she has done so far with this whole project of Al-Qalam, Poets in the Park, basically honoring the renowned and the less known writers of the Pen League, the Rabita Al-Qalamiyya, who helped shape literary culture, not only for Arab Americans, but Lebanese, Syrians, and Syrians, but also for people in the Arab world, and some influence, as I'm sure you know, American culture as well, and beyond. Actually, again, another reason why I'm interested. I heard actually a lot about these people who were mentioned that you were honoring, that the Qalam Poets in the Park honored while I was growing up. My father happened to know all of them. He translated some of Gibran's works to English, and he was the only one who got written permission from Gibran to translate from his Arabic works to his English ones.
Wow.
And so that's how we have books signed by Rihani, by Khail Naimi, by Nadra Haddad, by almost all of the major figures that you honored over the past few days. And to me, it was truly educational. Although the press, we didn't have many newspapers or magazines at all. There were a small number of magazines. For example, my father had a copy of a Samir by Elia Abu Madi, which was edited, and in which he wrote a short article about my father when he went back to Lebanon. And this was around 1934. And the other interesting thing about it also was that Elia Abu Madi, my father translated some of his works into English. He translated the riddles, the At-Talasa, to English. And the first recently published, again, by Greg Orphaly, but it originally was published in the Republican newspaper in Massachusetts, which was used to publish articles about poetry, published literary works, not just news. So that was also a very, very interesting story for me. So I became very much interested. And when I came here to the United States, I usually first came to Massachusetts, and I have relatives there. That's where many are. And on the weekends, the people who immigrated to the United States in around early 1900s, 1920s, 1930s, they would meet every weekend. Sometimes they got newspapers, Arabic language newspapers. Most of them were from the United States. And some even got a couple of papers from Lebanon. And so sometimes they would ask me to read these stories. And I was fascinated, actually. I was fascinated by the stories they told about their experience in the United States. And also that's what introduced me firsthand to some of these newspapers. And that's when I began to try to get some information and learn about them. And actually, was able to do some work and interview some of the people who wrote in these papers at that time. And when the family of the Bukarzals did the 100th anniversary of Al-Huda newspaper, they asked me to present a talk about Al-Huda and its contribution. Al-Huda was probably the most influential newspaper, Arabic language newspaper published in the United States. And it was the second oldest newspaper, that longest surviving newspaper up after Al-Ahram. Al-Ahram also was founded, by the way, by Lebanese journalists, writers, the Taqla family. And many of the newspapers in Egypt and magazines like Al-Muqattam, Al-Hilal, Al-Jami'a by Farah Hantoun, and many others these were people who came from Lebanon. And that's what makes this interesting. Why? At least for me it was. I don't know if it's, for me, because I started learning new things that I didn't know very much about. And that was that Lebanon was, and Syria to a certain extent, and later Palestine as well. Well, the areas where you began to see a revolution and a Nahda, which was established, actually started by a number of prominent literary figures, people like Ahmad Faris Shidia, people like Nasif al-Yazji, and many of these prominent writers who revolutionized Arabic literature. They also tried to go back to classical Arabic as well, because there had been a decline under the Ottomans of this culture, this language, in many ways. And they were transforming. Part of it was that they were also influenced by the West. Since the 16th century, we began to see missionaries going to the Middle East from Europe, from France, Britain, Germany, Austria. And later, we began to see some from Russia and the United States as well. And they started building basically schools, clinics, hospitals, colleges, universities in the region. American University of Beirut, which was first known as the Syrian Protestant College. You had also, in addition to these, you had the Russians, began the Russian Imperial Society, established schools. It was headquarters in Nasra in Palestine, but they opened schools in Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. And they taught Russian literature, by the way. That's where Naimi, one of the figures, literary figure, was very much influenced by Russian culture as well as by Sufi culture historically. And so this is, again, played a very important part. And you began to get the printing presses for the first time. Printing presses came to Aleppo. And that's when they first started. Then one of those presses ended up in a monastery in Lebanon. And they started printing first religious texts, but later on they began to go back to the old works of Arabic literature, Arabic poetry, printed the Alf Layla wa Layla, printed works such as Al-Zir Abu Layla al-Mu'alla. They had also, in addition to the Antara, and then they began with Jahid and others. And that was, in many ways, revolutionary, because you began to have also under the rule of the Manid emirs and the Shihabi emirs in Lebanon, there was an era of openness that we began to see that was also open to the West. There was interaction. They began to learn about Western culture. And partly this is what, since the missionaries tried to reach wider audience. And in fact, their original purpose, many of them, was to convert Muslims to Christianity. They didn't do a very good job of it. They weren't able to, didn't succeed. But they actually, what they succeeded at, they began to convert some Eastern Christians to some of the Western sects, Catholicism or Protestantism. And so, but that was also very important because it opened new earth. And that's what we began to see, the changes that sort of revolutionized not only the Arabic literature, but also the media. And here, the role of the Arab American press had a tremendous impact. Because as soon as people began to leave, and Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, and later from other Arab countries, from Yemen, from Iraq, what we began to see is that many of these people, as soon as they basically came to the United States, within less than 2 or 3 years, they began to publish newspapers and magazines in Arabic. And this was phenomenal when you think of it. A small community of 10 to 15,000 people had between 82 and 1892 and 1900, about eight newspapers published in different parts of the United States. Most of them were in New York, but there were several in other places. And by the way, this wasn't also only happening in North America. That was happening in South America, where other immigrants, in fact, the first Arabic language papers published in the Americas was in Brazil in 1890, and the first in the United States in 1892. And this publication, the first public, was called Kawkab America, the American planet or the American star. And what's fascinating about this is that the Arbilis family, they're originally from Syria. The whole family immigrated to the United States. First, they left Syria, and when the father was a medical doctor, he had studied at the Syrian Protestant college. But because of what happened, the atrocities that took place in 1860, many people left, and where there were attacks on Christians in Damascus at that time and some of the other areas. And later, one of the people, by the way, who played a very important role in saving Christians at that time was a man, probably most of you, I don't know how many. I'd be interested actually in knowing how many of you have heard of him. Amir Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi. How many have heard of him? He was an amazing figure. He was fought against the French colonialists in Algeria for almost 20-25 years. And later he was arrested, taken to France. They gave him a castle and he stayed there for a while. But he decided to go to the Ottoman Empire. He went to Turkey, to Bursa, where because of he had Sufi interest. But he wasn't very comfortable there. So he ended up going to Damascus. And when the attacks began to take place, he challenged them. He went to the streets, brought Christians to his house. So he had a palace. And there were the hooligans who were doing all of this, tried to attack him. And he brought his men. He had something like 800 fighters who had fought with him in Algeria against the French. They told him, why are you protecting these infidels? Didn't you fight the infidels yourself? He said, yes, I fought the French because they tried to occupy my country. But these people are your brothers. And what you're doing is totally unacceptable. Islam does not. So basically, this family, who are the Arbilis, came to the United States and established the first Arabic language newspaper. First paper was 4 pages, 3 in Arabic and 1 in English. After a while, they stopped publishing the English, and it was all Arabic. And it was an amazing newspaper, partly because it was, first of all, it remained loyal to the Ottomans, interestingly. But partly because then they were able to get the first Arabic printing press to the United States for these papers because they had a good relations. And one of the sons, the Arbili sons, later on was appointed consul in Jerusalem, in the American consulate by President McKinley. And he spoke he spoke Arabic, English, fluently, Arabic, English, Greek, some Latin, French, and Hebrew, and Aramaic. Wow. So this family, although unfortunately many of them died young, had problems, health issues, etc., but they nevertheless were the first, and I would say probably the most influential, because they influenced other newspapers later on. There were several others. Of course, the next most important at that time was the Al-Asr. And then there was one that was established by Nahum Mukarza in Philadelphia. Nahum Mukarza came from Lebanon, and he tried to start, have a paper. It didn't last very long, a few months. It didn't succeed. But that didn't discourage him. Very short time after that, he decided to start another paper, and that was Al-Huda, that I mentioned earlier, in 1898. And this paper probably was the most influential Arabic language newspaper published in the United States. Although there was rivalry between them and other papers that came much later, such as Mir'at al-Gharb, the Mirror of the West, which was basically established by a number of Syrian writers. And also you had a Sa'ih as well, by the Haddad brothers, and Abdul Masih, who you're talking about, as well as Nadra Haddad. In addition, and they were quite influential. However, one of the unfortunate things that was happening at that time is that you began to have sectarian newspapers. Al-Huda sort of moved towards the Maronites. And Mir'at al-Gharb more towards the Orthodox Christians. Al-Bayan towards the Druze community that existed at that time. And there was Muslim as well, and Catholic one, Amin al-Ghraib. Amin al-Ghraib was also influential because it was people like Gibran and Amin al-Rihani who started publishing their work in his newspaper. And what is so fascinating about this is that, in fact, it was these papers, and by the way, between the 1892 and 1930, there were about 80 newspapers and magazines published in Arabic in the United States. Some of these lasted only a few months or a couple of years. Others, however, as like Al-Huda, lasted almost 100 years. Some lasted 50, 30, varied. And what's fascinating about this is that they also were very much influenced by the American media as well. The freedom of the press in the United States. That was extremely important because the press that existed in the Middle East was often always had to be very careful what they say, what they write. And many were paid a heavy price. For example, Najib Diab, who later started with the Kawkab America newspapers and later worked with Mir'at al-Gharb, was his house and his property were seized by the Ottoman government because he criticized Ottoman oppression. And that also was, and he was in fact sentenced to death. This was not lifted until after the First World War. So you had this and these papers also opened their doors, let's call it that, to these literary figures, people like Rihani, people like Naimi, people like Gibran, people like Rashid Ayyub, like Wadi Bahut, and many, many others. And in fact, also some of them, like Al-Huda, was one of the first to open its doors to a woman, a true journalist, which I'm sure many of you have heard her name.
Oh, yes, yes.
But Afifa Kara. Exactly.
Sorry.
Yeah, as well as Afifa Kara. I'm sure how many of you have heard of Afifa Kara? That's pretty good. She was an amazing young woman who came, and she married when she was 14 to a relative of hers, much older, and she came with her mother. And one time she was very unhappy with a priest, and they lived in Louisiana. So she wrote a letter to the Al-Huda editor complaining, but then she felt very bad about it. And so she asked him to return the letter to her, not to print it, but he was impressed with her. And he told her to continue to write. So he encouraged her to write. And he said he started sending her books and magazines to read and study. And later she became she translated works from French and English to Arabic. She also, around 1911, she bought the newspaper from the brother of Saloum Mukarzal Naum, who later would establish the first English language magazine called The Syrian World, which was an extremely impressive work. That influence in many, especially it was aimed at the younger generation of Arab Americans, Syrian Americans, Lebanese Americans, whatever you want to call them. And they were studying basically because he felt that they need to reach out to the young generation who did not know Arabic. But he wanted them to know about, first, to keep the link with the old country, as it was often called, the homeland of their parents. And that was quite a development. And he was able to attract many people, some of them like Philip Hette, like Amir Rihani, like Gibran, Naimi to write for, as well as many others. Also, a few times he was able to get also American writers authors. And in addition to that, he had in every issue brought the news from the Middle East. Another thing that these newspapers did, by the way, they also, for example, during the First World War, when many people were starved to death, and when they got the news, they were able to gather money to help the people in the Middle East. And they sent quite a bit of aid to the region. However, there were also disagreements among them, basically because some of the papers favored Arab or Syrian union. They felt that Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, of course, but they should be one country and part of Iraq. While Al-Huda and Naum Mukarzam said that they would like to see Lebanon as an independent country. That should not become part of it. They said, yes, we're willing to work, to cooperate with other Arab countries, but we want Lebanon to remain an independent state. And they also participated in a very important conference that's not enough has been written about it. This occurred in Paris in 1913. Naum Mukarzal and Georgi Badran were representing the Arab American community. and so basically,
We're not having a debate here now.
Oh, we will.
So basically, what we saw as a result of this, in a sense, that was one of the main, achievements. But they disagreed there about what they were going to do. Some favored the establishment of a what you might call a, a an independent Arab state. They even began to later supported the efforts of the Sharif Hussein and his son Faisal, who led the Pan Arab movement and the revolt against the Ottomans. And others, however, like Naum Karzai, favored the Lebanese independence. And so there were those who favored a consociational state. That means like the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There was an Austrian emperor, but there were two sort of self-ruling governments, and they wanted the Arabic language to be the official language in the Arab countries. And so basically the main thing that I'll end with is that here we had they not only let people know about what's going on in the Arab world, but they let people know about what's happening in the US. Several newspapers had doctors answering questions to people who are ill, complaining about their different health issues, and sending questions and got answers from the doctors in those newspapers. They also taught people about American Constitution, and what their responsibilities as citizens. They also fought, one of the few times where they united against when Arab American, Lebanese, Palestinian, Syrian were considered to be members of the yellow race, and therefore they stopped. They wanted to prevent them from gaining citizenship and immigrating to the US. And anyway, that was they worked together.
Yeah, so we need to.
And raised they took the case to the courts. There's a long story. I'll tell you about it maybe later. Let me stop here.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll have to move on to hear from our last speaker, but I hope that we will have time to discuss more in the question period. So our last speaker will be joining us on Zoom. There he is, Ghazwan Arslan, Professor of Arabic at Tulane University in the Department of Comparative Literature. He completed his PhD.
Thank you, Pammy, so I can see his face. Thank you.
In comparative literature from Queen Mary University in London in 2020. And before joining Tulane, Arslan worked as an assistant professor of comparative literature at Larabit Vessi University in Algeria. His research focuses on the relationship between aesthetics, ethics, and politics in modern and contemporary Arabic literature, or Arab literature in Arabic, English, and French, especially in its relationship to classical Arabic and world literatures. His first book, Gibran Khalil Gibran as Arab World Literature, was published with Edinburgh University Press in 2024. Please join me in welcoming Ghazwan Arslan.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here amongst you. Thank you very much, Dr. Linda, for inviting me to speak today. It's really an honor. It's also an honor to speak today with esteemed colleagues like Dr. Edmund and Bawardi. I remember reading Bawardi's book when I was a PhD student, and that was very informative. My talk is going to be a bit different from what you heard. I'm going to focus on something very, very specific about Gibran and a detail that has to do with intellectual history. A forgotten detail, I must add, about that intellectual history and the things that went into shaping Gibran's creative imagination and prophetic imagination. But as a side note, I was really happy to hear the name of Abdul Qadir, Amir Abdul Qadir Jazairi mentioned in Edmund's talk. I did not expect that to happen today, but it's a testament to the fact that all these small and little histories are connected together. This is one of the things that I will try to show is that how separate things, different things, histories, theories, ideas, notions are connected in strange but very compelling ways. So I'm going to focus on the work of Khalil Gibran from the perspective of intellectual history and creative imagination. A well-known Mahjari or immigrant writer, poet, artist, essayist in the United States, Gibran's hallmark lies in his experimentation with new styles and modes of writing and his endeavor to think through literature the world anew, indeed to think the human anew in two languages, Arabic and English, not to mention his original talent as a visual artist. Even the conception of God was something that Gibran thought deeply about, and he did so thanks to his prophetic imagination. The prophetic here, I understand it as a poetic mode of writing, of thinking, of dwelling in the world, one that tries to reimagine the boundaries of God, the world, and the self. This is why Gibran's creative imagination has been described as visionary, as a rupture, as a new beginning in modern Arabic literature, in the words of Adonis, the Ali Ahmed Said Isber, the well-known modernist poet. But I will not focus on this rupture today, and I'm not going to focus on this new beginning, which has been much studied and explored. I examine how Gibran's prophetic imagination enabled him to reinvent many key religious and Sufi concepts, to reinvent the religious itself through his own interpretation of evolutionism. Evolutionism being a traveling theory in the late 19th and early 20th century. And I emphasize reinvention because this is not merely a question of influence, but of adopting, rethinking, repurposing the old in a new context. What is that context? It's the modern world that is shaped by global forces of empire and imperialism, where theories, ideas, forms, styles travel from one place to another and are in the process transformed beyond uneven or unequal power relations between peoples. It is my contention here that Gibran's peculiar espousal of evolutionism as a metaphysical, not just physical law, was the offshoot of the Nahda, or the Arab Renaissance, in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And the Nahda, as you all know, witnessed the translation, the interpretation, the adaptation of many European theories and concepts in Arabic. As Marwa Shaqri has demonstrated remarkably, evolution for Arab readers of Darwin was about much more than biology and more than history. The new universal history for which it provided the blueprint was one with the power to recast the future, end quote. Going on to assert that in the Nahda, unquote, discussions of religion also increasingly attached the notions of the evolution of the idea of God and assigned a social function that could be considered and compared across a universal timeline. The coming of Darwin was thus accompanied by reconceptualizations of the meaning of religion itself, unquote. Evolutionism gained currency in the Nahda thanks largely to Al-Muqtataf, a popular scientific journal whose role in disseminating European scientific theories and discoveries from the 1870s onwards was widely influential. This induced a host of debates and discussions around the interpretation and validity of evolutionism in the Arab East. Shibli Shmail, an influential Nahda intellectual and one of the pioneering proponents of Darwinism, translates and reflects on evolutionism as Falsafat al-Nushu' wal-Irtiqa, literally the philosophy of evolution and progress, the title of one of his books that was published in 1910. Shmail's interpretation of evolutionism is strictly materialist, although with some mystical and pantheistic overturns to it. In one act play called Muda'aba, which I translate as Merry Conversation, written and published by Gibran in 1913 in Al-Funun, the Arab American journal edited by Nasib Arida, Shmail is included as a character in it. In the play, Gibran himself, Shmail, Amin Rihani, and Sheikh Iskandar al-Azzar, a Lebanese poet, are sitting in a cafe in Mount Lebanon discussing a variety of topics that include the nature of religion, poetry, imagination, referring in the process to Darwinism, to Turner, the British painter, to John Keats, and Friedrich Nietzsche. The discussion is joined by an ordinary man speaking the Lebanese dialect, Al-Ammi, who would question some of their assumptions. But what I'm really interested in here is what Gibran had to say in response to Shmail's adoption of natural selection as a principle of social reality. Gibran says the following, and this is my own translation. Your reason, doctor, in reference to Shmail, moves between the teachings of Darwin and the principle of Nietzsche, and I share this conviction with you. However, Were Darwin and Nietzsche able to truly demonstrate what is the best or the fittest? For what Nietzsche deems full of will and nobility may actually bring about weakness and abjectness. Who can say with absolute confidence that the distant visions that visit the soul of a Sufi is not one of the elements that nature selects as a mechanism to preserve the fittest and maintain the best? I am a worshipper of power, al-quwwa, but I love all the manifestations of power, not one of them only. End quote. This is a very peculiar interpretation of Darwinian evolutionism. Gibran does not dismiss natural selection, nor does he simply believe that the spiritual negates the material. On the contrary, he extends Darwinian evolutionism into the realm of the spiritual by way of an interpretation that partly rests on his own understanding of Nietzsche. And he does so in a way that accounts for human creativity in literature and the arts. In other words, the Darwinian principles of natural selection and survival of the fittest are deployed to explain cultural and aesthetic phenomena, and not just social phenomena, as is the case with social Darwinism that was prevalent at the time, mainly thanks to the work of Herbert Spencer. That Gibran is representing this in a play, however short, should not go unnoticed. As a literary genre, the play serves as a self-reflexive platform in which some of the issues, challenges, and aspirations of the Arab Renaissance, which are not just particular but universal, and this is one of my main points, are discussed and contested. Further, Gibran's authority as an author is subsumed by the play's dialogic nature, an example of how literature functions as an unresolved and necessary discursive space of representation, self-reflexivity, and contestation. A side note to this is that this is, I think, one of the writings that are not, known by Gibran. To follow up on Bawardi's talk, Gibran also published a number of plays. One of them is Al-Wujuh al-Mulawwana, the colorful faces, and it's about the life of actually Syrians in the United States, and it's written in a very realist register, unlike the other work of Gibran, which is either romantic or mystical. And these writings are yet to be translated. They are not known. They have been collected by John Day in a book called Aqidat Gibran, or Gibran's Doctrine. But many of these works remain untranslated. Now, going back to my talk, the evolutionist impulse of Gibran is also strongly echoed in an essay called Al-Jababira, The Giants, which he published in Al-Awasif, his book that came out in 1920. And here is my translation. I am an advocate of the law of evolution and progress, Sunnat al-Nushu' wal-Irtiqa, which to me applies to both immaterial and material living entities. For it transforms religions and nations to the better as much as it transforms all creatures from the fitting, to the fittest. Hence, there is only retrogression in appearance and decadence in the superficial. The law of evolution has diverse channels that are at bottom unified. Its manifestations, which are diverse, dark, and unfair, are repudiated by limited thoughts and renounced by weak hearts. Its invisible force, however, is just and enlightening, for it embraces a right that is higher than the rights of individuals, aims for an end that is loftier than the goals of the group, and listens to a voice that overwhelms in its immensity and pleasantness the sights of the ill-fated and the agonies of the tormented. For Gibran, thus, evolutionism is not only a philosophy but a historical, social, and metaphysical law, what he called sunnah. The expression itself, an-nushu' wal-irtiqa, is Shmail's. In another context, that of the future of the Arabic language, Gibran asserts that, and I quote, languages, like everything else, are subject to the law of the survival of the fittest, with the fittest understood as the inventive, what he called quwwat al-ibtikar, or the power of invention. This understanding of evolutionism shaped Gibran's worldview in many ways, which he laid out in many letters to Mary Haskell, his beloved American companion, who supported him for many years. By the beginning of World War I, for instance, Gibran's own conception of God begins to develop along evolutionist lines in some of these letters. He writes, for instance, if God the power, God the force, God the mind, God the subconsciousness of life is in all the struggles that take place on the planet, he must be in this war of nations. He is this war, unquote. To think of God in these terms, of course, is to radicalize and repudiate the notion of God as perfect being, even as agape in Christian and Islamic Sufi traditions. But what interests me here primarily is how he conceives of the notion of God as such, not its rational or theological validity. In other words, how he reconceptualizes the notion of God as a poetic thinker. He goes on to speculate that, and quote, the mind of this world is not free from its body. And as long as the body is struggling for more life, the mind will go on struggling for more life, more mind. There is no such thing as struggle for death, end quote. God, the subconsciousness of life, is not in this case separate from life, as he is the struggle itself. Gibran goes on to say that there is nothing on this planet but a struggle for life, which characterizes every physical or mental movement, every wave of the sea, and every thought or dream, end quote. This radical understanding of life as an eternal struggle renders man elemental, in Gibran's words, a part of nature where the elements declare war on each other. This is how Gibran justifies the act of war, conceiving of violence, albeit implicitly, as natural as the struggle for life itself, and reducing man to a mere element in nature. This emphasis on the struggle of life is evidently an evolutionist notion, and it has its echoes, as we saw earlier in Gibran's Arabic work. And I'm really interested in this connecting between the Arabic and English writings of Gibran. And I think one of the things that we have seen over the years in studies of Gibran and in understandings of Gibran is that the English side is separate from the Arabic side. And I think we can see a lot of connections here if we read both of these currents together. The human soul for Gibran, however, is endowed, unlike the elements, with, and I quote, the desire for more of itself, hunger for that which is beyond itself, a notion inspired from the Sufi embodied concept of ash-shawq, or longing, which he inscribed in an evolutionary worldview where all the elements from low to high are constantly evolving by means of an inbuilt desire, which for Gibran is the law and matter of all life. All of these, of course, quotes are from the letters. Other equally significant properties of the soul, according to Gibran, include the power and desire to seek God, even as heat seeks height or water seeks the sea. End quote. Echoing the Sufi highest stations of annihilation, fana, and persistence or subsistence, baqa, in God, the soul, speculates Gibran, never loses its inherent properties when it reaches God. Salt does not lose its saltness in the sea. Its properties are inherent and eternal. End quote. But for Gibran, these Sufi notions are reinvented beyond monotheism and its eschatology. Life for him is all there is. Life stands for existence and being, which, like God, is ever evolving. These reflections are echoed in his one-act play, Iram Dhat al-Imad, Iram, the City of Lofty Pillars, which is inspired from the Quran, initially published in 1921, in his book Al-Bada'a' wal-Tara'if, a collection of essays and prose pieces, I think collected by Nasib Arida and published in 1923, and in many of his English writings, and especially through the notion of the greater or the larger self, which is the last thing I will highlight in my talk today. In other words, we cannot dissociate Gibran's English and Arabic works, nor can we understand the particularity of his thought and creative imagination without situating it in its intellectual history, but without, in the same breath, reducing it to it. For what we see here is a creative mind of his time, but also a creative mind that sought to transcend its time. Indeed, his prophetic imagination lingers, inspires, remains, especially through this emphasis on the notion of the greater self, on the qualifier greater, which can be described as the moving force of his late thought. If evolutionism shaped in many ways the way Gibran thought and wrote, it was his prophetic imagination that stamped evolution with his own understanding of it, becoming not just a metaphysical law as we saw earlier, but a creative paradox in his poetry and thought. This is illustrated, for instance, when Al-Mustafa speaks about freedom in his book, The Prophet. At the city gate and by your fireside, I have seen you prostrate yourself, worship your own freedom, and my heart bled within me. For you can only be free when even the desire of seeking freedom becomes a harness to you, when you cease to speak of freedom as a goal and fulfillment. And how shall you rise beyond your days and nights unless you break the chains which you at the dawn of your understanding have fastened around your noon hour? In truth, that which you call freedom is the strongest of these chains, though its links glitter in the sun and dazzle your eyes. Only a radical freedom that always questions itself as it enacts itself can resist its modern fetishization and trivialization. Al-Mustafa is drawing attention to the conditions of freedom rather than to freedom itself. For freedom not to become a yoke and a handcuff, in his own words, worn by the freest among you, these conditions must be radically and constantly questioned and unchained, to use his metaphor. That is to say, alertness to the conditions of freedom is the primary condition of freedom itself, what he calls greater freedom. The latter remains always a deferred possibility and can never be an attained actuality. For it must never turn, Al-Mustafa suggests, into a doctrine or an idol in allusion to its instrumentalization in modern politics. Freedom, that is to say, must be ever evolving, just like God, just like the human soul. The qualifier greater is more than a qualifier here. It conveys the embodied practice of conquering oneself constantly, of slaying one's burdened self, in longing to attain larger and freer selves, themselves the premise of yet larger and freer selves. This is how Sufism is filtered through evolutionism in Gibran's thought. This example shows that prophetic imagination seeks to question the present and its conditions so that the poetic can help us dwell better in the world. Yet his vision is partly informed by the specific context of traveling theories and ideas which are reworked and repurposed in new context. Gibran was not simply a poet. He was a poetic thinker who sought to reframe the way we think about ourselves and the world, the modern world to be more specific. Whatever the limitations of his poetic thought, it remains of this world and for this world. It remains alive. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so we will open the floor for questions. We're trying to finish in 10 minutes.
If possible.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll have some brief time for questions. I saw your hand here first.
Oh my God, thank you so much for this cathartic narration of Gibran's work. It's truly like I'm like really in awe of everything that you've mentioned, and in my current readings of poetry and like the imagination of the city, and like there is just one thing that I want to read. I'm thinking of any like conversation I had with a friend about the epic verses of Homer, those words through which the exile finds a home, where poetry arrives as a sanctuary from the clutches of oblivion, preserving identity and singing of its contours. And at that moment, I wondered, who then will sing of Troy? And in my view, poetry in this context represents a land that shields its inhabitants from oblivion. Poems emerge as a force that geographically etches existence into the fabric of history. And as Mahmoud Darwish once put it, they anchored the landscapes of life within the eternity of the word. So thank you so much for this narration. Orphalese is New York. Orphalese is New York, and it's every hub that generated this force of life that we call poetry. And I'm thinking, as Ustad Edmund mentioned, about those writers, Mikhail Naima, when he was conversing with the likes of Tolstoy and Pushkin, and was influenced as well with transcendentalism, and kind of like shared this connection with Gibran as well, and echoed all of this knowledge about life and beyond, and they live on. It's not just contained within this like little neighborhood, Little Syria and the Lower West Side, but it just like echoes across the Atlantic and into like every heart that is free and knows what they were headed towards. So this is just like a question I had probably was, what do you think this makes of the imagination of the city, and what this would, and this is open to all of the wonderful panel discussions about how the echo of the city continues beyond its geography. So yeah, thank you so much.
Who would like to take it? Yeah.
Well, I'm a historian. I think the one thing we should need, and we haven't paid attention to, is what happened and when, and then engaging interpretations. So narrative is a story, right? And the Arab American story has yet to be written, and that cannot happen without faithful translations of what life was like, not just by Abdul Masih Haddad, but all of those authors who felt the reality, sensed it, interpreted it, understood it, and left it for us in a copious publications to understand. I also want, I don't want to engage into debates, but when I say they cared about the fate of Syria in the 1913 first Arab conference in Paris in 1913, the United Syrian Society, which is a society that should be known, understood, and documented, hasn't been. I have a single document from that society or two, and to my mind, they're the only ones in existence that I can find so far. They did send an emissary to that conference, and that was Najib Diab. And he made a very important pronouncement there. Naum Mukazzal made a very short, terse remark because he had the full support of the French and didn't need the immigrant support. Actually, he did not have it. Putting things together, one of the theories that should be understood, or the ideas or the evidence I have, is that yes, Al-Huda was influential, and Naum Mukazzal reminds us at every turn that it was the widest circulating newspaper it may have, but it was parochial. It injected sectarianism, and the response came from all the other newspapers whose editors were not Maronites. They happened to be Orthodox, but they actually rose above sectarianism to talk about the fate of Syria. They were all in agreement about, hey, we have to do something about the fate of Palestine. When the Balfour Declaration news spread, and then when they found out about the Sykes-Picot Agreement after the French Revolution and the Sykes-Picot Agreement and then the San Remo Agreement, Amina Rihani, who's a Maronite, who was excommunicated on Gibran because of his views, wrote so much about Palestine that his family collected all his writings, and that was enough for a book. And we kind of glide over that in Arab American studies. We don't want to look there, and New York suffers for it. New York is not telling the full story. New York needs to come to terms with the history and the content, the Arab content by the Arab American, Syrian American authors who wrote as Arab, felt as Arab. We should not shy away from that content and never forget that Lebanon is the heart of Syria, and Syria was their mother. And they actually said as much, specifically by the GDF.
Any other responses to that question? Okay, we'll move to the second question. Yes.
I just want to say I'm very grateful for this panel. I've spent a lot of time on Atlantic Avenue because of this yearning and longing to know more about Little Syria. And I wanted to say a couple of things. One is I really appreciated how, sorry, I didn't catch your name, Professor
Hani?
Hani. Okay.
Bawardi?
Yeah,
Hani's good.
I really appreciated how you emphasized how the art at the time and the writing of the time, the intention behind it was to serve as a mirror for society, because I feel as an Arab artist and writer, there is this obligation to romanticize the homeland. And a lot of our art is devoted to defending our people against misconceptions and stereotypes. And I find that there is no space for artists and writers to turn the mirror towards their own people, towards us as Arabs and our flaws. And especially as an Arab American, I feel there's a lot of stories that are not told because we're in survival mode and we don't have permission to talk about things that are happening within our own society. So I really appreciated how you mentioned that. And as a question, I wanted to say, something I've thought about ever since I was a kid, really obsessively, is what makes somebody come to this country? Because I was in love with Syria. It was my biggest heartbreak every year coming back from Syria because my mother lived there. And I could never, even though I was born in this country, I always felt like an immigrant. I could never assimilate and just accept that this is home. It's never felt right. And ever since I was a kid, I wondered what made my grandpa take a boat and come here. It just never made sense to me. I know now we have war and we have, it's not even really a decision that it's kind of they're forced to leave. Many are forced to leave, and Syrian refugees make up, I think, one of the largest proportions of displaced people. But I think I'm very curious about what is the first story that arrived to Syria that made people, convinced people to start coming here in the 1880s? Like, what's the first narrative that arrived that kind of invited them here? Yeah.
This is an initial event I need to mention very, very quickly. 1876, there was the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition, 1876. A lot of people came from parts of Syria, including Jerusalem. Palestinians who are Syrians at the time went back, spread the word. Again, in 1893, the Chicago World Exposition reinforced that, and they were, Linda serves that subject well. And we have good evidence about who came, and the travel became easier. And frankly, there's far more opportunity here than there was in Syria at the time, whose fate was not clear. And World War I was upon them. 1913 was a peak year because everyone knew that World War I is coming. Opportunity, survival, and the United States at the time had a benign presence in the Middle East. It wasn't like now. Did not pick up the slack where the British imperialism, colonialism left off. So it was, they really loved the promise of America of bringing stability to their land.
There's also an immigration rules story here, right? Because in 1921, right, that the Quota Act comes into effect and says basically, and then the Immigration Act of 1924, which says that basically immigration to the United States can only come from Northern and Western Europe. And so there's a decline in Arab immigration because they're suddenly classified as unwanted immigrants. And so there's like this early moment that we're talking about is this huge flourishing of Arab American Arab immigration to the United States. And then there's a very low period that follows until really the 1980s. So there are these two big waves of Arab immigration.
When Lyndon Johnson in 64 got rid of the quotas, yeah, that was
the Hart-Celler Act,
65.
1965.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that you're talking about, I mean, why did they come to America? They came to America for several reasons. First, they wanted to flee oppression. But there was a very oppressive government by Ottoman government and where people, especially minorities, for a long time, for example, you did not have Christians, Shia, Druze serve in government or serve in the military. So that was one. And then you had the Khatti Humayun, Gul Hani, and Khatti Humayun Sharif. And these were stands that were taken by the government in Istanbul, partly under Western pressure, but partly also because you began to see a revolutionary more, what I would say, a government, especially interestingly enough, there were close relations emerging with Germany at that time, Prussia and later Germany with the Ottomans. And that brought different ideas to the government and the way the government was dealing, and partly also because you began to see something else. The other reason is that by the year about 18, I would say around the 1870s, the idea of the Homestead Act that was adopted by President Lincoln, giving free land to farmers, people who want to farm in the Midwest, reached the Middle East. They heard that the King of America was giving free land to peasants. So that was another reason. People wanted to have a better way of life. That's another reason, because and flee what they were. And especially when you look to the area where many of these people were coming, they came mostly first. It's true what Hani was saying, that some came from, for example, to the Chicago and to the Philadelphia festival. In fact, that's where, by the way, ice cream cones emerged, because they learned how to make ice cream cones, because one of the people who was trying to sell ice cream, basically, he had cups and they ran through them and they couldn't sell anymore. So basically, and it was somebody from Syria originally who was next door to him, started making cups for him. It cooked so he could put ice cream, and so that's where the idea of the ice cream cone came from. But that was the second main reason. What happened, the events that took place in Syria also were a factor in 1960. Syria and Lebanon, to a certain extent, were also factors that influenced many people. In fact, many, when they first came, they wanted to go back. But some, of course, stayed. Some made money, did well, went back. That also encouraged others to move to the United States.
Okay, I think we need to stop.
We're at the end of our time.
Yeah, thank you so much. Can we applaud